Welcome to Behind the Smile with Ash Butterss, a podcast designed to reveal the truth behind the masks we wear. Together, we look to demystify the human mind and its behaviours in relation to mental health, trauma and addiction. My name's Ash and I'll be your host as we uncover the real stories of people's pain and the steps they've taken to live a life of freedom in recovery. From sobriety to spirituality, join me each week as we uncover the reasons why people seek recovery and how their lives have changed by living one day at a time.
Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Behind the Smile. Today on the show we have Maz Compton. Maz is a well-known Australian TV and radio host and is the creator of Last Drinks, a sobriety podcast sharing honest conversations about life without alcohol. Maz made the decision to quit drinking on the 1st of January 2015, which means she has over 8 years of sobriety. Maz is a very busy woman, not only being the mum of son Henry and cute pooch Happy, but she's also the co-host of her own breakfast radio show on Hit FM. I am beyond thrilled that Maz has found the time to join me here today. So without any further delay, I'd love to introduce Maz onto the show. Maz, welcome to Behind the Smile. How are you?
Oh, Ash, I'm so good, and thanks for having me. I'm a huge fan of you and your work, so this is a real treat. And you know what? It's kind of weird for me to not be the one hosting the podcast, so I feel a bit out of sorts.
Totally, we're turning the tables today, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And you're dialing in from your workspace, is that right? I can see the banner behind you.
Yes, branding, always branding the show. No, but I'm holed up in my radio studio where I do the show live every morning. And it's a quiet space that hopefully nobody will interrupt me in. So, quieter than my home.
For sure. I understand that with a young son and a dog and a husband, it must all be happening back there. All right. So
it's a busy, loud house.
I can imagine. Now, I would love for our audience to get to know a little bit about you before we dive into your photo today. So to kick things off, can I get you to start with sharing perhaps where you grew up, where you live now, what you do for work, and what do you do for fun?
Yes. So, where do I start? It's a pretty big story. But I grew up, I was born in the UK actually, and my mum's from the Caribbean. She's from Trinidad. My dad was from the UK. So I lived there till I was 8, and then 8 years old we moved to the Northern Beaches in Sydney because my dad wanted to be a minister. Random. So we moved to Australia for him to study at Bible college for a whole year. And then I think my parents just loved it. And so we never went home. So my grandparents sold our home. We stayed here. And then I kind of grew up on the Northern Beaches. And so I had a really cool childhood because I think at the time you don't realize anything when you're 8. But at 8 years old, to leave a country and go to another country where you don't know anyone or anything really taught me how to adapt, I think. I learned at a young age how to just get on with it. And I think it created a bit of resilience in me. And I think when I was in my teen years, I used to watch MTV and I really wanted to be on it. So I wrote that down in my journal one day. And through a really long, complex story of 9 years of trying to kind of get this gig on MTV, I eventually did, which is pretty hectic.
That's
so
amazing.
At 24, it's pretty wild. At 24, I got the exact job that I had written down in my diary when I was 15 years old.
Wow.
So if you don't believe in the power of manifestation, there it is. And then I worked at MTV, as a VJ, traveling the world, interviewing celebrities and just having, a pretty good time getting paid to do all of that stuff. And then I sort of pivoted and I got into radio because I was kind of edging into the age of 30, which at the time was oh my God. And I just was do I want to be that 30-year-old chick on MTV, which is a really youth-centric brand? So I pivoted into radio, and then that sort of brings us to now where, I get up every morning and I host a breakfast show. It goes across all of New South Wales. And I love my radio life so much. I love the platform of radio because it gives you like direct access to the audience, and it gives you like an insight into their world because they can call in. It's the only platform where people can live call in still, really. You can do an Instagram live and people can comment, but you can't actually talk to them. And I think when you speak to people and you hear tone and there is use of intonation and awkward silences, that makes for such a great interaction, and you can't get that online. So I love what I do. I now live on the Central Coast. As I said, our show goes all across New South Wales. I'm married. I have a kid and a dog, and I like wearing denim dresses, you know?
I love that. I love all of that. The Central Coast is a pretty beautiful part of the world to live in. So I'm glad to hear you landed there.
Yeah. And look, I took some time out from media for a couple of years. And during that time, we moved up here with zero intention of me kind of getting back into media. I'd sort of pivoted again, but into fitness, and we owned a gym and I was studying nutrition. And then when I found out I was pregnant, I really just was like, affordability wise, the Central Coast is a bit more doable for us. Let's move there and hopefully try and save and buy a home so we can raise this crazy child. And then when Henry was about just before he was about 18 months, I got an invitation to come back on air. And then, that was 2.5 years ago.
Wow. So it sounds like a lot of your life revolves around work, but tell me, what do you do for fun these days?
Oh, I love that you asked that question because so much of what I talk about is work. But we live on the beach. I feel very, very blessed that I'm able to raise my family by the beach, and I grew up on the beach. So if there's any downtime and there's not any chores to do, we will definitely go to the beach as a family. But I'm a nature junkie. Like, get me on a bushwalk, out in nature, in an ocean pool, like whatever's outdoors, I am so into. And my favorite thing to do ever is to snowboard, which is not easily accessible from the Central Coast.
No.
But we do try every couple of years to go on like a big ski trip somewhere in the world. And so I feel very fortunate that when we can, we do. In fact, for my 40th birthday, which was a couple of years ago, my husband and I, and Henry was 1, we went to Japan. And so, because he was like, do you want to do a party? And I was like, no, I just want to go snowboarding for 10 days. So we did. We went to Niseko in Japan, and we did a 10-day family holiday, and him and I skied every day, and Henry was in daycare. And it was the first time he'd seen snow. We took him on a toboggan. It was the cutest family holiday in the world. And that was like my number one above any other thing that I wanted to do was go skiing with my family.
That's amazing. You've literally described like the top of my bucket list is to get over to Japan for a ski season. I just think it would be incredible. All right.
So it's absolutely awesome.
Amazing. Now, Maz, I've asked you to bring in a photo today. And now this photo is from a time in your life where you are hiding behind a smile. So your insides weren't matching your outsides, and you were projecting one version of yourself to the world, but the reality was you were struggling on the inside. I would love for you now to describe for our listeners what's going on in the photo and what was actually happening for you internally at that time in your life.
Yeah, I love this too, Ash, because it really, first of all, I could have sent you any photo from about a 15-year period in my life where I was, smiling and internally not. So, I guess that sort of paints a picture of what was going on for me, which was this kind of imposter syndrome double life situation. So as I explained, I got this really amazing job on MTV, and then I pivoted into radio. And so as an adult, I spent a lot of my time hanging out with famous people. And I always felt really weird about it because sometimes I'd be backstage with Alicia Keys and be like, oh my God, how am I here? Like, this is so cool. But like, what? What do you mean? And so I was put in these incredible situations, but they just felt weird. And I felt like I was living a bit of a lie and I was being a bit of a fraud because I was like, I'd be interviewing the Foo Fighters, but fangirling inside, but then playing it cool on the outside. And then there'd be other times where I was cool on the inside, but then like pretending to fangirl on the outside, like reading the room and playing into, like in a way, I think I kind of had to become a bit of a chameleon and just sort of adapt to my environment because of my job and because of how out of reach it felt, even when I was in it. So I would get phone calls from producers saying, hey, you've got to go interview Sandra Bullock. And like 17-year-old Maz is dying because she's my favorite actress of all time. And then like mature professional DJ Maz is like, yeah, girl, you got me. Like, it's crazy.
Yeah.
So the particular photo that I sent you is a representation, I think, of all of that. And the story behind the photo is this. I was living in Adelaide at the time. I had just gone through a divorce, so I was very fragile. I was trying to work out what life was like for single Maz again after a failed marriage. So there was a lot of shame that I was carrying. And I got some tickets to the Soundwave Festival. And so my friend Yvette flew down from Sydney and we went to the Soundwave Festival together. And she took this photo and this is how I do life, right? Like most people just go to a festival. Because I worked in media, I hit up the publicist, I got backstage passes and I decided to line up a whole bunch of interviews with the artists and make like a whole behind the scenes kind of like online show for the radio show that I was working at. So that photo was a photo of me on my way to interview Slash. And I was so happy, but inside I was so sad. And I had a great day, but I had a beer in my hand for most of it. And I think that picture of me like backstage, killing it, look at what I'm wearing, look at that smile. But internally, with a bit of context, you could understand I was lonely, I was carrying shame, and I think I was trying to fill my life with big, cool stories to make me feel something that never really came until eventually I worked out that it was self-love and self-worth that I needed. And that only came when I stopped drinking. So that smile it's a big, long, like 15, 20-year smile.
Wow. And if you're projecting that to the world for such a long period of time, I imagine that connection back to self becomes harder to tap into because you're never spending much time in your authentic true self. So you become more familiar with actually playing the character and playing the role. Was that line blurred between your home life and your at work, on show type of life?
Yeah, I blended them into one. And I love the way you use the word character. That's exactly what I was doing. I created a character. And I think I was so uncomfortable being alone. The irony, because I was so lonely, but I hated being by myself, that I surrounded myself with booze and friends to distract myself from the work that I needed to do for self-acceptance and self-worth and self-love. And so I think over time, I built up a dependency on alcohol because that felt like it was serving me because it helped me avoid doing the work. But at some point with alcohol, as you would probably know, it stops serving you and it starts being a disservice. And when that switch happens, that's when I think you really have to question your relationship with alcohol. So I was just masking pain and doing it in a socially acceptable way.
Yeah, I can absolutely relate to that. I'd love to take it back a moment now. When did you first start experimenting with alcohol? What age were you and what did that look like?
Yeah, so I had my first drink at a high school musical after party when I was 15 years old. And it was horrendously humiliating because I got blackout drunk. I passed out at the after party before the music had even started because we were pre-gaming. And I just had no idea that alcohol was a poison or carcinogenic or anything. I was just like, it's the after party, everyone's drinking, I need to drink. And I'm a very tiny person. And I'd never had alcohol before. So it just knocked me for six. And you would think after such a humiliating experience, my friend called her mum to come and get me. And then they took me to her house. Then her mum tried to like sober me up before she called my parents, who came to get me from, like, it was an absolute shocker. And you would think after such a horrendous experience that you wouldn't ever drink again. But next weekend, I just didn't drink as much or get, as blackout drunk. And so the story goes that you just drank every weekend, or, maybe not every weekend at school, but whenever there was a party every few months, you would. And that was teenagehood. And then you turn 18 and then it's fine. It's legal and you can, go and purchase your own booze and hang out with your mates. And it doesn't feel like it's dramatic or horrendous. And I think because for me, nothing really chaotic ever happened. Like, I'm very lucky. When I think about some of the situations I could have ended up in, I feel very lucky. But nothing crazy ever happened. So I didn't ever lose anything big enough for the wake-up call. I just sort of was self-medicating and just like stumbling along. And it was kind of just okay. And then once I got into media, it was just like, oh, there's like they unlock the bar fridge on a Friday and it's just some people would stay there until Saturday. Like it was a pretty wild time in the industry.
Yeah. And I imagine the kind of work that you were doing, whether even if you were off site, you were at these festivals, at these gigs, was there almost an expectation to be drinking?
100%. And alcohol is free and alcohol is everywhere. And so you'd walk into an event and you just wouldn't even, it was almost, if you weren't drinking, you're the weird person. And so even just to avoid that conversation, you would just make sure that you kind of kept up with everybody. And so there was absolutely an expectation. And that I think, and I've said this before, like I don't blame the industry for the dependence that I developed on alcohol, but it certainly didn't help. And there certainly weren't conversations around sobriety, which there are now, which is fantastic. But at the time, I've been sober for 8 years. So it's a long time ago that I'm talking about. I feel like we're progressing, which is wonderful. But the industry for me in media, it was hand in hand. Like your job was just full of boozy events.
So you mentioned that you didn't have any of these sort of big rock bottom moments that were able to sort of wake you up. But what did your drinking look like then? Were you drinking the same amount as those around you, or did you find that you were needing to drink more over time to get the same effect? How did that play out?
Yeah, so definitely when I look back, my tolerance definitely increased. So I would have to drink a little bit more year on year probably to get the same buzz, if you will. I wasn't drinking more or less than the next person, but I was circling around people who drank most nights of the week. So again, it was kind of normal. Like there wasn't a moment where I was like, oh, until probably it was 2014 was the year that I got a bit curious about sobriety because I was so done. I'm like, I don't want to do this anymore, but I have no idea how to stop. And it wasn't for me a rock bottom. It was just a crossroads where I could just see if I kept heading down that path, I didn't like my chances of it ending up in a good place. And so rather than wait for it to end up chaotic or for me to have some crazy accident or something horrendous to happen, I was like, girlfriend, get it in check now because you can get it in check now because you have this ability to adapt. So if you can adapt to an alcohol-fueled life, you can adapt to a sober life. You just need to get on board with it. That was like the internal dialogue that year for me.
So what was going on in your life at that time? I'd love to know, in particular, you mentioned that you had that separation with your ex-husband. So were you sober at that time or were you still drinking at that time? Was there cracks in the marriage? Like what was happening on the outside for you to maybe look at your drinking, apart from the fact that you were just sick and tired of feeling sick and tired?
Yeah, so I think that the divorce was probably a catalyst of my drinking spiraling. So the irony around why our marriage didn't work and the fact that then I started drinking even more when we broke up is pretty hilarious to look back on. But after the marriage breakdown, I did start drinking to cope. And so that went on for 5 years before I got sober. So I do think that year on year, my tolerance increased, but also my loss of self increased. And every year I got these really amazing opportunities with my career. I felt more disconnected from my true self. So I drank more to fill the void. And so that's why I think, over those 5 years after I got divorced, it just got to a point where I was like, okay, something's got to give. And it was really just me at that time. And I had met my now husband in 2014, that same year. And I remember thinking, when we met, I was like, I don't want him to see the worst of me because I think I'm falling in love. So I don't want to potentially lose like this, what I think could be great, on bad choices. So meeting him, and we never had a conversation about it. In fact, when I rang him, so we were in a long distance relationship for 6 months, and I called him in about the October, and I was like, hey, I think I have a drinking problem. And he was like, what? And I was like, yeah. I think I need to stop drinking, and would you support me in that? And he was like, yeah. He's like, but is it really that bad? I'm like, yeah, I just haven't told you or shown you. So, he was definitely a part of, me wanting to become the best version of me because I wanted to be better. Yeah.
I love how you described the fact that there wasn't necessarily a rock bottom for you, but you had that inner knowing that your life could get better. And also, this was at a time where there wasn't a lot of sober, curious conversations. Was there anybody in your life at the time that was sober, or someone that you were able to look towards for guidance? Like, how did you start to navigate all of this?
Yeah, you're right. There was zero hashtags about sober curiosity in 2014 when I was thinking about my relationship with alcohol. And honestly, Ash, how it started, and it's a pretty heavy part of the story, but my manager at the time, Mark Byrne, he died suddenly of a heart attack, and he had been sober for a decade. He had gone to Alcoholics Anonymous. I was well aware of his sobriety journey, and he literally dropped dead, and it just rocked me so hard. And I remember thinking, I don't want this to be the reason that I end up in a really bad place. So I want to manage this grief and process it well. How can I do that when my only coping mechanism is drinking? So because Mark was sober and I wanted to honor his life, I started thinking about my relationship with alcohol and what I could do to kind of, rein it in, I guess. So I actually, he passed away on the 5th of September. I came up to Sydney for the funeral. I was living in Melbourne at the time. It was the saddest thing ever. And in about the October, I actually Googled, am I an alcoholic? And which wasn't helpful. Like, don't do that. It's not helpful. It's such an outdated term. It's so like, it just didn't help. Because you know why? Because I read it and I was like, no, I'm not. I was like, I'm not. I don't think I am. According to the definition I read, I was like, well, that's not me. So then what am I? Because I'm not sober. I'm not coping. I'm not happy. I have zero coping skills other than alcohol. So what am I going to do? And then the voice of my mother, beamed into my psyche. And she used to always say to me growing up, if nothing changes, nothing changes. And I was like, well, I've been doing this drinking thing for a really long time and it's not working for me anymore. So I'm going to have to do a new thing. What's the new thing I can do? Well, the new thing has to be not drink. That's the only thing I can change in order to get change, and then see how that feels. So it was around, after Mark's death, and that Google search, not helpful. That's when I really started thinking, hey, I want I want to try sobriety. And that's when I called my boyfriend at the time and I told my mum. Again, I swear my mum was like, you what? What do you mean you've got a drinking problem? I was like, oh, yeah, I've been living away from home for a while, Mum. So, yeah, I made those calls for my accountability people and then I decided I'd stop drinking on the 1st of January. So I gave it a good nudge until January and then I reined it in and I have not had a drink since.
That's incredible. Well done, Maz. Phenomenal part of your
Thanks.
story.
It's weird because I was so scared of being sober. Like Ash, oh my God. I remember thinking I would have like full anxiety leading into knowing I'm going to quit on the 1st of January. And in that December, I would think about not drinking and I would be panicked at what am I going to do? What are people going to say? How am I going to feel? Like I was just so overwhelmed with fear of what sobriety might be. And then like it wasn't actually that bad. It was actually, I don't want to say it was easy. I think for me personally, stopping drinking was actually easy. It was embracing my true, authentic, sober self that was difficult. And
Yeah.
it was leaning into the uncomfortability of something that was new. And it was explaining it to dickheads. Like that was the biggest challenge was like people getting in your face and buying you shots at the bar when you said, hey, I'm sober. I haven't had a drink for 3 months. I don't want to do shots of tequila with you. That was one of the, they were the challenges and they weren't the challenges that I was kind of anxious about when I was looking at sobriety. So I hope that's an encouragement to someone listening. If they're considering sobriety, it's not as scary as you think it's going to be. It's definitely challenging. It's definitely difficult, but it's worth it.
I completely echo that. I have never met anybody that's ever said to me, I regretted getting sober. There's always more positives to gain from making this life decision. And yeah, of course, you don't have anything to numb the edges. So when life stuff happens, like you have to feel it. You don't get to numb out and ignore it. But what I've found in that is that you also then get to process it in real time and move forward. And you don't have any of this stuff hanging over you that's withholding you from life. You really do experience life as it's happening in its most authentic form. For me, one of the most difficult parts of being sober has been learning to sit in those painful emotions. When things come up, like recently I've had a bit of grief come up, and it's been really hard. And my head will sometimes still go to a drink would fix this, but it's a fleeting thought. And then my second thought is, but when has alcohol ever made anything better in your life? So I really quickly am able to pivot from that. And I lean into different tools that I now have, like learning to sit in it, to take a quiet moment, journal, meditate. What are some of the things that you do, Maz, if you experience that same difficulty, which I think you may do because it's a part of being sober?
Well, yeah, it's funny. Like I truly don't, I really, especially in the last few years, haven't thought a drink will fix this. And I think it's because I really landed on this idea that alcohol never changed my situation. It just bent my brain about it. So when my friend died, and then I, got incredibly drunk at his funeral because I was very, very sad, as were a lot of people that were there, it didn't bring him back. It just bent my brain on the situation temporarily. And so but I also have tools as well. So maybe it's just because I have like a whole sober toolkit that I can go to so that, even the thought of having a drink really doesn't come in. So similarly, like I can, I will sit and meditate. I'm such a nature bunny. So I feel like I can, get on top of my emotions or big things that are happening. And 2022 is probably one of the most difficult years of my life. But I managed to navigate it all like pretty well considering. And it's because, I have those little inbuilt things like I exercise regularly, I stay hydrated, I talk to a therapist, I journal a lot. And I got really good last year at saying no. And that was really as a full-blown empath and a major people pleaser, and my love language is acts of service. I'm not usually the no, someone else can do that person. I will do this if it is the death of me because I want to please you. And
Yeah.
last year, just because my load was so heavy and so big, I actually said no a few times. And that was such a key because I was such a martyr about stuff, especially as a mum. And I've learned that when I'm not good, I'm no good for anyone. So I really have had to, and it's still a work in progress, but really like doing the self-care stuff, just those little tiny things that I need work for me. Because I think as a mom with a full-time job and writing a book and doing a podcast, there's very little time for me. But those like carving out those little tiny self-care things, asking for a break for 40 minutes to meditate or go for a walk, that stuff serves me and fills me up. It keeps me level. And then I'm good. I'm good for everyone that I need to be good for. But that, again, work in progress, slowly getting there.
Yeah. Can I tell you, I had a really similar experience. I've worked on this a lot, particularly in the last 12 months. When I went through the process of getting sober and through therapy and working with a sponsor and being able to see my stuff and see my life and how it's played out to this date, I was able to identify some key patterns. And similarly, this people pleasing just kept coming up time and time again. And then it was reframed to me that people pleasing was a form of manipulation, because at the end of the day, I was doing these different behaviors and doing these things for people in the hope that there was that exchange of love. And if I am the person that you need me to be, then you will love me. And so when it was flipped on its head, and this person, a dear friend of mine, said, perhaps you're actually just approval sucking, I was like, it really flipped the switch. And I was able to think, oh, okay, maybe it's not this like, oh, I'm such an amazing person type of behavior. And that in that, it empowered me
100%.
to learn the word no. It's a game changer.
Yeah. It is. And it's also, I think it is hard to do the no and not attach it to laziness or selfishness. Like that's a really hard thing for me. And I kind of have to do this self-talk thing where I kind of have a list of questions of like, just making sure that I'm not being selfish and that I'm not being lazy, because my negative self-talk brain can be quite debilitating. And again, it's self-awareness, it's knowing who I am and what voices are circling in my head. And just to have those like self-check questions of like, does this mean you're being lazy? No. Does this mean that you're being selfish? No. Well, then it's okay. This is a boundary, and boundaries are healthy.
Absolutely. I love the idea that you've got those self-check questions, because I think we all hear the phrase boundaries, but I think people find them really difficult to implement and to know what a healthy boundary can actually look like. So to be able to have those little questions, and I'm sure they'd look different for everyone depending on their circumstances, but what a great tool to be able to kind of sense check. Are you saying no because you just really don't want to do it and you probably should? Or have you got enough on your plate? You've overextended yourself as it is, and you're not going to be any better to anyone by saying yes to an additional task or opportunity. I would love to know this identity that you created over that 15 years of working first at MTV and then pivoting into radio. How did that identity of this party girl shift when you got sober, but you maintained a career in the media?
Yeah, well, that is a great question, because when I was looking at sobriety, I had just hit the very peak of my radio career. And so it really was do or die. Like in 2015, I got the job to host the Sydney Breakfast Show, which anyone who works in radio on air is after that job, basically. It's like the biggest and the baddest job, which comes with so much pressure and so much stress, FYI. So heading into that year, I was like, I really don't want to screw this up. I've worked so hard to get this job. I finally have this job. That was also a big part of the sobriety thing then. I was like, I either get sober now and make the most of this career opportunity, or I don't get sober and it's going to blow up in my face. And so that year I worked so incredibly hard, and maybe that was a blessing because I didn't have heaps of free time to sit around and wonder, what sobriety was looking like for me. I was just getting on with it and doing it sober. So it kind of caught up with me mid-year. I was like, oh, yeah, I haven't had a drink for 6 months. That's awesome. I'm going to keep going. And it was that constant explaining to everyone that was the frustrating thing, you know. But I do remember having a conversation with one of the girls at work. Her name's Bron. And she said to me a few months into my sobriety, she's like, you're really serious about this not drinking thing. Like, do you think you'll ever drink again? And I was like, look, it's 2015. I've been sober for a few months. I feel amazing. I look really good. I have my dream job. I'm dating this really cool guy. And honestly, I've worked basically my whole adult life for this season. So I said, the only thing that would honestly make me consider drinking again at this point is if I lost my job, because it would be, my identity is so wrapped up in what I do. Like, I am the girl from the radio. And I couldn't separate the two. I'd blended myself into my job. I thought if I lost that job, that would be so difficult. And lo and behold, on the 6th of October that year, I got a phone call saying that I lost my job. And I remember it so vividly. And it was just one of those random things where a new CEO came into the company, didn't love our show, and decided to replace us with someone else. It happens all the time. But I went like home really upset, obviously. Like, losing your job is really crap. But then when there's assholes writing about it in the media and stuff as well, it's not helpful. Yeah. But I did go home and I was like, do I want to have a drink today? And I was like, well, no. And that's when I realized I wasn't going to drink again, because I was like, the worst thing that I could articulate 3 months ago about me losing my sobriety has just happened. And maybe it's because I might have a slight strain of oppositional defiance disorder, but I was like, well, I'm definitely not drinking now. Like, whichever way you look at it, you know, it was that was such a defining thing. And then, but then what happened, Ash, is, so then I leave this media job, and it was terribly sad and really humiliating. And then I just really had to sit with me, and I had loads of free time to work out who I was outside of radio. And I went on a complete journey of self-discovery, and I finally realized who I was eventually after months and months of not working in media, and what I stood for and what I cared about and what I was good at and what I wanted to learn. And so I did like basically 12 months of sobriety in the lead up to this huge bit of self-discovery that only would have happened unless I lost my job, really, because at the time I lost that identity, but that was the birth of my truth, really.
And what a pivotal moment that would have played out to be, because had you gone back to drinking at that time, I imagine this entire space of self-discovery that you weren't into and started this journey of self-discovery, that never would have happened had you started drinking again, because then you would have just been distracted and you would have moved on to the next thing.
Oh, I was just going to say, it was so clear in that moment. I was like, I do not need to drink to cope with how hard this is. I've got this. And that's like, that was major. So, you know, subsequently, other big stuff has happened in my life that hasn't been terribly fun. But I think knowing from that moment that I've got this regardless of what it is keeps me going. And that again is, you know, just circling back to why I probably don't even have drinking on the radar, is because I have had to go through some pretty rubbish stuff in the last few years with my big girl pants on, you know, and not leaning into vices and substances, like really just sitting with stuff and going through, like, being an adult really sucks sometimes. Like, it really just, it's really hard.
Yeah.
It just is. Like, it just sucks sometimes. It's great, but then it sucks sometimes.
I completely agree. What you mentioned that you started to get to know who you really were after losing the job and then staying sober for that period of time. So tell me, what are some of the things that you discovered about yourself once you became sober and went through that experience and learnt to sit in the shit, as I like to describe it?
Yes. I have a PhD D in shit sitting. So the biggest revelation for me, Ash, is that I am an introvert. And I thought I was an extrovert until I was 36 years old. And I thought I was an extrovert because I started working in media. I was really good at it. My job is to perform. I felt comfortable on stage, hosting audiences. I've spoken in front of 50,000 people at a stadium and didn't, not even a bead of sweat on my brow. Like, I have this really great ability to engage audiences. I am great on live TV. I'm great on live radio. So you would just assume that I'm an extrovert because I assumed that I was an extrovert. And what I learned in sobriety is that I'm an introvert, and I actually refuel by being alone and quiet. So this is why when I look back on the history, I would always go on like solo holidays. When I was single, I would just go to Bali for like 2 weeks by myself and just do like hectic yoga retreats and not talk to anyone. And it's kind of weird because I wasn't doing Kentucky tours with other people because I actually just wanted to be alone. And like when you look at it, it's so obvious, right? But I didn't realize it at the time. My refueling happens when I'm at home. So what I learned about myself was that I need to honor that. And the other reason that I needed to embrace the fact that I was an introvert was that I used to get really anxious before I would go out to parties. But I just didn't realize I was anxious. I was like, oh, I'm a bit nervous. And so I would have a few drinks, like a couple of Sub-Zeros, and then off we go. And I didn't realize that was actually me not honoring my introversion. So I'm an extroverted introvert. I have a really big personality and I can engage with people in crowds and on stage and whatever. But when it's my own time, like, stay away, do not call. I will be at home in my pajamas with a hot water bottle, watching television, and I will be so goddamn happy. And when I really started honoring that, I leveled out and I just really started to understand who I was. And then all the chaos made sense. Then when I would look back, I'm like, oh my God, no wonder I was acting like a nuffy. I was so incredibly uncomfortable and I was putting myself in situations that I thought I wanted to be in, but I absolutely didn't want to be in. And so I really got a sense of ease and I got this inner peace that I've never felt in my adult life until that year of sobriety, where I could peacefully be so comfortable just being either by myself or with my partner or cooking in the kitchen or doing whatever, doing all the stuff that I know can fill me up now that isn't a requirement of having an extroverted personality.
Isn't it amazing that what we were searching for all along, firstly, I so relate to what you've just described. And for me, it's like what I've discovered is what I was searching for all along was actually already inside me. But for some reason, for the years that I was putting a poison down my throat, it disconnected me from that part of myself that was actually there just waiting to allow me to feel content and to feel peaceful and to feel comfortable within my own skin.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maz, how have your relationships changed since you got sober?
Well, look, in 2015, I was circling, with a lot of people in the radio world, but then I kind of left radio the year after. So naturally, a lot of those relationships kind of fizzle out because, time and location. We're not spending every day together in a studio, and some people move after that show kind of blew up. Some people moved and whatever, and I just moved into a totally different season in life. So a lot of relationships, and there were people who I kind of used to drink with as well the year prior. So a lot of those sorts of relationships naturally fizzled out. And then when I realized I was an introvert, I was like, oh God, thank God I don't have to make any more friends. This is excellent. So I just was really grateful that I could just have, like my handful of buddies who are my ride or dies, and nurture those relationships and just invest my time, being a beautiful and present friend for those friends and vice versa. And then my romantic relationship just grew from strength to strength. And, we're now married and we have a 4-year-old. So that's pretty awesome. That worked out really well. But even little things like my mum, we've always been really close. But mum and I would used to sit, she she's got this beautiful outlook onto a lake, and we'd sit on the grass and just like smash champagnes together, because mum just loves her cheese platters and a champagne, as you should when you're retired. But we've just changed our hanging out time, and so we go for more walks now, or we'll go kayaking, or we'll just do cool stuff instead of sitting and chatting and drinking together. And not that my mum has a drinking problem at all. She just loves a glass of wine. It's not an issue for her. But I feel like we've just been way more deeply connected in the last few years. And I think me having a son, which is her only grandchild, who's so spoiled, it's not funny, definitely brought us closer together. But I just feel like we have this just a whole nother level of connection and honesty and vulnerability, because I took her on the journey. I was like, hey, I'm telling you and I'm telling Glenn, and they're the only people that need to know right now, because I trust you inherently. So I think, and as far as, like new people in my life, I think as a mom, you meet cool chicks down at the park and you hang out because your kids have stuff in common, and that's really cool. But as far as those like really deep level relationships, people who know me, people who I share my stuff with, the handful of friends that are around me, they are the deepest, most special relationships, and they've only gotten better since I've been sober, because I think I've become a better friend too.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. It becomes quality over quantity, doesn't it?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Now, what would you say, Maz, to someone who is contemplating getting sober, but they're really fearful about living life without alcohol, whether they think that like my life is going to be so boring or I'm going to lose my friends? What would you say to someone that's in that position right now?
It's so hard, because if you're not willing to take the risk, you're never going to know. I guess what I would say is that whatever your worst fear is, it won't be that bad. So if you're worried about losing all your friends, you might just lose 2. But if you lose friends over your sobriety, I would argue that those friendships weren't serving the true essence of who you are anyway. If you think you're going to be bored, that's just not true. I think all you do, like, you still have the same 24 hours in a day. You'll just remember more of those hours when you're sober, and you'll find other stuff to do. So if you're committed to filling in your time by doing something other than drinking, you won't be bored at all. And I sound like such a parent, but boredom is a state of mind, in my opinion. It's just like, there is so much to do. There are so many wonderful things on offer outside of your front doorstep. And you just have to lean in and embrace them. So, and I fully get the fear, because I felt those fears as well, but it wasn't as bad as what it was. And then when the worst possible thing that I could ever even imagine happened, I was still okay. Like, I wasn't okay, but I was okay in the end, because I got through it. And so I think, the 2 key things, I think, for people who are like, I want to be sober, but I'm so scared. I think the 2 key things are, just dive in and see how it feels. Like, just do it and see, and don't have any expectations on yourself. Like, just wake up one day and don't have a drink, and get through the whole day, regardless of how good or shit that day is. Don't have a drink, get your head on the pillow, go to bed, and wake up the next day. And simplify it down to, well, regardless of what happens today, I'm just not going to drink alcohol. Like, take the pressure off, And then the other thing, I think, is to probably give yourselves like 3 or 6 months as a goal on time. And like the circuit breaker 30 days is the greatest way to start. And I've got a 30-day circuit breaker plan in my book that's coming out mid-year. And it is exactly that. It's a circuit breaker. You've then got to do I think like at least a season in it for you to understand what a whole season being 3 months of life looks like. And then if you can do double that, then you're going to give yourself an idea of what sobriety will start to look like on you, especially if you've been binge drinking or gray area drinking for like 20 years or something. You know, you're going to have to do a fair bit of time in sobriety before your body starts to recalibrate, before your neural pathways start to rewire, and before it starts to feel kind of like okay and normal. So, yeah, I think just lean in and do it. Like, take out any expectations and give yourselves 3 to 6 months.
That's some sound advice there. I completely agree with what you said. I think the idea of a season is really fantastic because you need that accumulation of time to really start to feel the long-lasting benefits. And then once you get a taste of those, it's like you don't actually even want to go back because life is just so good, so much better sober. Maz, I like to close out each episode asking my guests the same final question. And so I'm going to ask you that one now. The question is, what are your 3 non-negotiables that allow you to live a life today that is happy, joyous, and free?
Oh, what a great question. My 3 non-negotiables. That's hard. I've got it probably more than 3. I think on a practical level, my number one, like the thing that I think is the most underrated pillar of health is sleep. And so I need to sleep. And I didn't like sleeping when I was drinking, you know, because you stay out but especially as a parent and like, you know, doing all the things that I do, my sleep quality has to be good. So I have little things in place, like a little dehumidifier. There's lavender mist on my pillow. I listen to like a deep sleep body scan every night before I go to bed. I just have I have a sleep routine because I want my sleep to be excellent, because not having good quality sleep is a non-negotiable. It just does not work. It doesn't actually work for anyone. So even there might be someone listening that's like, nah, I'm fine on 4 hours. You're not. You might think you're fine on 4 hours, but what it does over time, sleep debt is so catastrophic in our bodies and our brains. So I need to sleep, which sounds so boring. But it is what it is. My second non-negotiable, and this one's been a tricky one since I've been back at work, but my family is my priority. They're my responsibility, but they're also my priority. So making sure that my family is number one and that we're all good. And so prioritizing family, and that involves that, you know, that's just little things like we're going camping this weekend just to create some really cool memories. And I make sure that I'm present when I spend time with my son. And I try as best I can to put my phone away so that when I'm with him, I'm engaged and I'm present and I'm setting a really good example. My husband and I go to marriage counseling, not because our marriage is falling apart, just because we want to keep it intact. And marriage is really hard. So there's certain things that I do within my family relationships to make sure that my family stays intact, because I love them so much and I care for them so much. And I want it to be, I want our family unit to just rock it, you know? And so that has meant saying no to gigs. That has meant saying no to MC work. A couple of years ago, it meant no to a big job opportunity, because I was like, that's going to take me away from being able to, you know, be the present mum and wife that I want to be for my family. So, so the non-negotiable, I think, is, I don't know how to articulate it, but all of that stuff that I just said. Like family as a priority, definitely. And then the third one for me, again, I think just really practical, but I just need to exercise. That is just, it makes me tick. It gets me high. I love it. It's the best. And that can be different iterations in different seasons of life, you know. At the moment, I'm getting old, man. My knees just don't like high intensity workouts anymore. So I'm doing more like weight-based stuff and more yoga stuff. But when I had my son, I had an emergency cesarean. So I had to just change. I had to start all over again and start walking and really building up my strength. So I've been through a really big kind of fitness journey. And it doesn't mean that I'm just like ripped and toned, but for me, exercise is so good for my mental health. And just with a bit of family history with mental health stuff, I just know I need to keep on top of it. And so that for me is like, if it can't happen daily, it needs to happen every second day. And I think even if it's just a walk around the block. So if I can go for a walk around the block with my son on his bike and my dog, and then get to bed early, that's literally my 3 non-negotiables sorted.
Yes. That is so, so awesome, Maz. I think people can really relate to all of those. I know I certainly do. So thank you so much for sharing them with us. And thank you so much for being here. It's been such a joy to have you on the show. If people want to find out more, you mentioned there's a book coming out middle of the year. Where can people go to find out more about yourself and what you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram. That's probably the best place to connect. So I'm Maz Compton on Instagram, or you can go to my website, mazcompton.com, and keep up with the radio show, my podcast, and the book release dates are all up there.
Incredible. Well, Maz, we say here on the show that when we recover loudly, no one need suffer in silence. So thank you for being a part of this journey and sharing your story with us today.
Thanks, Ash. You're so wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Maz.
A big thank you for tuning in today. If you'd like to support the show, you can do so by clicking the subscribe button and leaving a review. Every review helps this podcast become more discoverable, meaning more people can hear these stories of strength and hope. Together, we will continue to remove the stigma around mental health, trauma, and addiction. Remember to reach out to those you care about, and I'll see you next time.